Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello. Welcome back.
I am Vanessa Chang, and this is Clara Bloom, and we are the curatorial co-directors of Exposure. I'm excited to share the screen with Clara today because we both have a graduate academic background in literature and cultural studies, and we are now bringing our professional nerddom to this panel for your listening pleasure.
Are you ready to nerd out, Vanessa?
I'm so ready. I was born ready.
Excellent. Because we have an incredible, stellar lineup prepared for you. 5 panelists plus 1 special guest appearance. And they're here from different fields: creative writing, data science, machine learning, and AI art. We're here to discuss the future of literature. And I'd like to introduce our first panelists. Our first panelist is a teacher of creative writing at UC Berkeley, an international best-selling author, an executive producer of the Netflix series based on one of his most famous novels. I'm sorry, it's almost one of the most famous novels, Sacred Games, and a co-founder and CEO of the storytelling software startup Antica. Most importantly, he was one of the early supporters of The Grid. So Wyatt described him as literally being in the business of narrative. I think that's one of the coolest quotes I've ever read. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome our first panelist, Vikang Chandra.
Hi. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm just going to go straight into my spiel,
Okay.
which begins some 4,000 years ago in India. At the time of the earliest of the composition of the earliest Vedas. And it's very clear in those texts that the conception of the universe there is that language is what creates and sustains the universe. And so I'm going to skip ahead some 1,500 years to about 500 BCE, where when a man named Pāṇini, a linguist, publishes what we sometimes call the grammar of Sanskrit, which is called the Ashtadhyayi, 8 chapters. But it's not at all a grammar in the traditional sense. It is actually a very complex algorithm, at the heart of which there are 3,976 rules. They're very, very short. You can print them out in about 40 pages of printed 12-point text. And there are various kinds of rules. There are heading rules, which divide the entire book into various sections. There are meta rules, which define how the other rules work. And the operational rules actually are string functions. They take in strings and they output other strings. And so what they do is they take in phonemes or roots or words and then make them into something else. They transform them. And so what he manages to achieve with that, and this is unique in history, that he provides us with a complete formal definition of the Sanskrit language. And the result of that is that any grammatically correct Sanskrit sentence can be parsed completely and without ambiguity, right? So you don't have to throw neural nets at any sentence of Sanskrit. And I could go on and talk for hours about Pāṇini and his brilliant and beautiful creation, which has an influence through history on American linguistics specifically, and then through that into the programming languages that we use today. But another aspect of this obsession with language is the delight in poetry, and poetry of different sorts, the normal kinds of poetry that one finds all over the world, but also, I guess, what we might include in this panel, where we think about poetry as a machine. And so now I'm going to share my screen. Could we pop that up? Is that visible? There we go. Okay, so my first example is this one from the 14th century, from Vedanta Deshika, who was called the Lion of Poetry and Logic, and not just by himself, I should say. So this is a devotional poem. As you can see, he's talking about his deity, his incarnation of the Godhead, and he says he wants to be led to the feet of Lord Rangaraja. It looks like an ordinary poem, but if you pull apart its syllables like this, and then you start to move as a knight does in chess, in what they would call a horse's walk, and you keep going through this, And then when you've completed your circambulation throughout the poem, what you find is that he's actually made a completely different verse, a shloka, another poem to Lord Rangaraja, right? And this is therefore this form in Indian poetry is called the Turagapada, the horse's walk. Those of you who are graph nerds will recognize that this is a solution to the Knight's board problem for a grid of 8x4 size, right? And the clever thing also about this is that it's a Hamiltonian path, right? You touch all the nodes through this single vertice, but if you take this poem, print it out, and place it under itself, so it's like a mirror, you get a closed Hamiltonian path, right? You can go again and again through the whole thing. And so there are many, many forms of this kind of poetry, many, many different forms. So I want to show you another one, and this might remind you of OuLiPo, right? So this is Magha in a poem called Shishupala Vada, which means the killing of Shishupala. This is an epic poem, which is made up of only, this verse is only made up of two consonants, I'm sorry, bha and ra. And Sanskrit, as in German and some other languages, you can combine words together, right? So here, I don't know what it's called in other languages. In Sanskrit, when two words come together, the intersection of the two sometimes changes. That's called sandhi. So here we've pulled the words apart, right? And we can see that since it's an epic poem, it's a battle scene, right? There are elephants, there are warriors, the elephants are inducing fear. But in the Indian poetic and linguistic universe, if you're going to make a poem out of only two consonants, the lion of poetry and logic is going to come after you, and he's going to make a poem, a shloka made up of only one consonant, here as in ya, right? And this is again because Vedanta Deshika was a great devotee. It's another devotional poem. And in this poem, he is using every resource the language gave to him, right? Including the resources that the Pāṇinian grammar gives to him, because there you can take phonemes and roots and make up other words out of it, right? And so what he's doing is intensely hard. As far as I know, only 29 of these single consonant verses have been collected, right? And to understand what he's doing here, actually, without a translator, would require you to be at least a tiger of poetry and logic. So there's not many people left alive who can actually see what he's doing. Another form, we're back with Magha. Same poem, same epic poem. Here is another warrior scene. There's warrior heroes. There's soldiers who are roaring. If we do our familiar pulling the syllables apart operation, you might start to see certain patterns. But it becomes clearer if I draw an arrow like this, and then I read along this arrow, the syllables along this arrow. Sa, se, na, gamanha, rambhe, right? And what that is, it's the entire first line of the poem. And then if I draw another line like this, I get the second line of the poem. If I draw a line like this, I get the third line, and therefore then the fourth line. Right, so this is pretty brilliant, right? It's as if the poem, the entire shloka, is contained holographically within itself. But that's not all, right? Because what he's actually also doing here is he's drawing this figure, right? Which will be familiar to Indians who live today as a drum, right? And this form, therefore, is called the Muraja Bandha, the drum form, right? And there are thousands and thousands of these forms, pictorial forms. They drew lotuses, they drew swords, etc., etc. So here's another one from the 16th century. This is a verse about Krishna. He was just taken part in a wrestling match. He's being desired by all the ladies who are watching. And here, if we do our syllable pulling apart operation, and then we draw an arrow, series of arrows like this, and we bounce back and forth between the lines, what we're getting is sa, ma, na, la, range, right, which are also the first 5 syllables of the first line. And so what happens is when you complete this this walk, as it were, you get the entire first line of the poem. If you do it in the opposite direction, you get the entire second line of the poem, right? And so they had a sense of humor too. The form that is being drawn here is that which you might see in the earth, in the mud, if you walk behind a a cow and the cow starts peeing, right? So this is the cow urine form, right? Because it replicates that kind of wavy line in the earth.
So Vikram, how do you see these structural approach to literature being echoed in other approaches to kind of the prehistory of automation in literature? Sometimes when people talk about AI and lit, they mention practices like Dada or OuLiPo. Would you say this is part of that lineage?
Yeah. So it's variously. I mean, in the way of OuLiPo, these guys were doing OuLiPo a long time before OuLiPo was a thought in anyone's head, right? And there's actually a brilliant, I don't have time to show you some of the most brilliant things. There's a form called Shlesha, which is double meaning poetry, right? So that the same verse can have many meanings at the same time, up to 6, right? And there have been entire epic poems written that tell the 2 different epic stories at the same time. So the idea is that you set a constraint or a series of constraints, and then within that you manipulate language and you use the resources that language gives you to create something beautiful, but also that creates a sense of wonder, right? And this poetry is called the poetry of amazement, right?
Thank you. I think that's a perfect segue into our next question and our next panelist, the poetry of amazement and what automation and literature in a historic context have led to in this very real computational context that we're trying to analyze now. And with that, I'd like to introduce our second panelist. We'll be joined by Andrew Piper, a professor of languages, literatures, and cultures at McGill University. He also directs the Text Lab, a laboratory for cultural analytics at McGill, and he's the editor of the Journal of Cultural Analytics. His work focuses on using the tools of data science, machine learning, and natural language processing to promote a more inclusive understanding of culture and creativity. So welcome, Andrew Piper.
Hi, thank you.
It's so good to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be talking to folks outside of the academy.
Excellent.
I'm going to jump in. Let me share my screen as well. And
if it's okay with you, can I ask you a question beforehand? I'm sorry. I know we've been very strict with you guys, and we told you that we're very short on time, and now everyone's just like poo, 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 shooting away. But let me just circle back real quick and ask you a question so that we can situate our audience. Okay, so clearly in human and machine interaction, there's this underlying claim that the machine is supposed to make us better, to level out our shortcomings and stretch out our limitations. So now if you translate that claim into the creative realm of literature, that can actually mean a lot of things. And with Krantika, the startup that I mentioned earlier, Vikram, and you, Andrew, you're working together to do just that. It is a tool designed to help writers keep track of character attributes, timelines, and everything else that comes along with complex storytelling and entangled plots. You call it a reflexive text, which I think is pretty poetic in and of itself. It helps you get aware of, be aware of errors and contradictions in your writing. You're advising Krantika about how to de-bias books, and at Text Lab, you're working on a variety of projects using data science to help with exactly that, to de-bias books. And now this is clearly not a trivial problem out of many reasons, but especially because the concept of bias is not clearly defined. And so I wonder, how can AI help to fight stereotypes in literature? And what does it even mean to de-bias a book?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it goes directly into what I was going to show you on the slide. So actually, if you can pull those up.
Perfect, thank you.
I'll dive in. Yeah, so one of the things we're trying to do with Krantika is put tools in the hands of writers to give them the ability to reflect on what they're creating and how they're creating it, and with respect to what we call these sort of norms and predictive habits of writing. So when we're talking about bias, what we're trying to do is we're trying to challenge predictable things in culture, whether it's in movies, television, music, whatever, that maintain social hierarchies. Right? So it's not just anything that's predictable, but it's predictable things that also seem to maintain the kind of social structures that we inhabit that are themselves biased or unequal. So there's me in my lab blog of pictures of people sleeping while reading, which gets at a lot of what we do in the lab, is thinking about what happens. How do we track things when we're reading sort of unconsciously? That's one of our key questions. We have a bunch of different publications that we've produced through the lab that focus on questions of bias. Here are some examples of them. I'll give you a few examples from those, but the idea is to frame the issue here as one of, diversity is a content issue. We often think about diversity as, do we have the right people being represented in this organization or that? And what we try and look at using AI and technology is culture, sort of diversity and bias, they run throughout all forms of culture, all the language we use, all the texts we write, all the things that we create. That bias is going to manifest itself. So what can we do to sort of reverse that? And how severe is it? So some of the research that I like to share with people is, for example, when we were studying a collection of contemporary novels, about 2,000 to 3,000 novels, we looked at using machine learning, we're able to predict where the characters are and who the characters are in books, and then estimate what their genders are. And out of the 26,000 we looked at, we found about 38% were predicted to be women. The interesting thing about that number is two things. One is, if you just look at main characters, it's 50%, which tells you that when people can observe these things, when people can keep track, they try and adjust numbers towards sort of social expectations. When no one's looking, right? When you stop paying attention, suddenly those biases kick in, and then that number suddenly goes down. And for those who are mathy, you might appreciate that number is astonishingly close to the golden ratio. And so students in my lab have started calling it the golden ratio of patriarchy, because that number keeps coming up over and over again. If you look at women artists on Billboard 100, it's about 32%. If you look at the amount of words apportioned to women in Hollywood movies, it's about 30%. If you look at number of talks given to women academics over the past year, about 3,500 talks, about 31% of those by women. So you get these patterns that are incredibly quota-like. Like, it's remarkable that you can get that kind of consistency culturally. We can also begin to look at other categories besides genders. We can think about race. We can think about who's represented in movies. Here we see one of our strongest kind of biases we've ever encountered in studying culture, which is two white characters are 111 times more likely to be a top billing in a movie than two non-white characters. But we can also look at the way characters are depicted. So one of the things we looked at was, for example, if you look at the language surrounding characters of different ethnicities, what we find is that, for example, South Asian actors are much more likely, 30 times more likely, to talk about a place in South Asia, meaning they're probably playing, if you're an Indian actor, you're probably playing an Indian character. And so it's these kinds of things that are incredibly limiting in terms of people's expressive freedom. Here's an example from novels looking at words associated with characters by gender. So these are all the tools that machine learning and AI allow us to begin to detect. And you see very classic things like men tend to nod, women cry, men are very embodied in books, which was kind of surprising to us, but women have feelings and interact with other characters. And the point is, people look and say, well, that's not surprising. And the problem is, it's not surprising, right? This is exactly the ability now that we have to detect language at large scale across culture allows us to see just how predictable we're being. And so what we're trying to nudge people towards is things we can do right now. And the most obvious is start a conversation, whether it's with your network, your community, your workplace. What do you mean by bias? What do we mean by bias? How do we get a shared understanding of a word that's pretty complicated to understand? The other thing is to challenge people with, especially for this community, is let's get creative with our tools. That's what we're trying to do with Grantica is what are the tools we can give to writers to empower them to really challenge these stereotypes, these norms, and these ruts that they may get into as creative people. And the thing we're aiming for, we're not thinking about this as a checklist. Bias often people think of it as, well, if I just add this person or add that person, I'm okay. What we're trying to do is get towards unpredictability. Everything I've showed you is just how predictable culture is. And what we want to shoot for is this motto that we have in the lab, which is variance is power. The more varied people can be represented from different communities and groups, the more power they have, right? The danger, as the novelist Adichie says, the danger of the single story is incredibly limiting. So that's where we're trying to shoot for in developing these tools in our lab and through software that we can put in writers' hands.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew and Vikram. I love this work that you're doing, Grantika. In many ways, it's like Grantika is something of an external brain. And I think this really kind of picks up with this longer history and this idea that writing is a technology that that extends human memory, that extends the human brain. And in this respect, I think the incursion, if you will, of AI into writing practices really conjures some much older fears that people have, right? I mean, I think we can look back at Plato's critique of writing as a threat to memory and to identity here. So here's where I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who has created an artwork with AI that really tests these questions around AI, memory, and the kind of externalization of the human mind. So M. Eifler, aka Blink Pop Shift, is an artist and researcher working in sculptural proliferation, speculative archives, and computational prosthetics. They've published extensively in open research, as well as exhibited work performed internationally at various international venues, including the Exploratorium, SF MoMA, YBCA, Armory Show in New York, Seattle International Film Festival, the Smithsonian, among other venues. This year, they exhibited their artwork, Prosthetic Memory, which is a really fascinating work that introduces new provocations and the idea that writing is a technological extension of the mind and memory. Em, welcome. Great to see you again. Can you tell us a bit about your artwork and prosthetic memory?
So, hi. It's interesting to be here in a place where people are talking about stories as someone who does not internally store their own story. So I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about this project. So I have amnesia, and I have something called anterior retrograde amnesia, which means I don't remember my life story. I don't remember events that happened, but I do remember sort of skills and things like that. So I was really interested in how I could sort of combine the two components of literature, which is sort of the content in the pages and then the structure of the book that brings that content together. So here you'll see this is handmade paper notebooks that are bound together in binders, combined with daily videos. I shoot every day and then I edit them into these sort of like weekly story chunks that I publish online, which you can see on my channel if you want to follow along with them, Blink Pop Shift on YouTube. They're combined using this handmade version, sort of like a home rolled version of YOLO, which is a you only look once. So that algorithm is looking at the notebooks and trying to make associations, trying to figure out where in the notebooks it is, and then sort of show what video content is associated with that part of the notebook. This is the first stage in what is an ongoing project of making a more and more effective external memory for me. One of the things about this project that's been so exciting is that, like, not only is the paper notebooks made at my house, not only do I make all the videos myself, but the algorithm myself is completely home rolled. There are no cloud resources. It was all trained internally to my home using solar power and all that stuff. So it's a very intimate form of AI, which is not something that most people experience, right? Usually when we think about AI, we're thinking about this like domineering corporate structure or something that's like doing things to us instead of this internal intimate tool. Maybe in this context, I would call it like a form of memoir, where I'm using the AI as a way to sort of sew together all these little bits into a more sort of cohesive and usable whole. The other part of this project that I love is that you as the audience and me as the maker experience the content of the book in very similar ways. I've had experiences where I have shown the book to people who remembered when the page was being made in a way that I don't remember. So together we form a relationship with this book, with the videos and with the AI that I can't form on my own. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention in sort of this context is when we think about literature and storytelling, we often think about sort of the past as a material that you're using. Let me just come back to this here. The past is a material that you're using for creating a story, whether that's combining stories into characters or something. And this is a new way of using the past and sort of not knowing what the final story will be as you're making it.
that you go down is just so intriguing for how you really embody this kind of externalization of memory. And it becomes, I mean, when we've talked about in the past, not just this artwork, but a daily practice. It's really kind of an ongoing extension and circulation of yourself, and really revises this idea of what writing is in a really, to me, quite profound way.
Yeah,
great,
it's been interesting to have that experience of like the daily practice of something, and then also these sort of like big structural parts.
Yeah, and it's ongoing, right? Oh, Clara, you're on mute if you wanted to say something.
On mute. I just wanted to also congratulate you because M won an honorary mention of this year's Starts Prize with her prosthetic memory. Yes, that was pretty epic. DEI AI is coming to stay. I love it. Okay, Vanessa, take it away, our next panelist.
Thanks very much, Em. So the themes that Em just discussed about memory vis-a-vis AI become particularly interesting in the work of our next speaker. So Clemens Setz is an Austrian writer and translator. Since 2007, he's published a number of novel, short story collections and plays for which he's won several prizes, including the Heinrich von Kleist Prize, which is the most renowned prize for literature in the German-speaking world. In his work, Bot, Conversation Without an Author, it takes as its premise a bot program with the memory of his prior work. So Clemens, can you tell us more about Bot, your thinking behind it, and how you're engaging with ideas about literature as a mnemonic device?
Well, it started pretty in a very boring manner. So it was the plan by the publisher to make a book of conversations with me. And then we tried that, and like a normal interview book, like we would do with a famous writer. But then we saw the difference too. Famous writers, they have lived, they usually have a very interesting life, they have done things, they have adventures, and I didn't have all these things. So it was, there was a question and an answer, and they were never interesting, and so we thought, well, maybe we should scrap that weird idea of doing an interview book with me. But then I remembered something that was very moving to me. I had read a book about a robot that was created of Philip K. Dick after his death, like in 2005, I think. Google and some other company, they made a very realistic robot who had a very rudimentary, very simple kind of AI. He could only do one thing. He understood like a question, like the nouns, sort of, and then he would do a very simple text search in all of Philip K. Dick's writings, letters, diaries, whatever, would find something that would maybe contain that word, and then say that. There was very simple, absolutely non-sophisticated piece of software, and I thought, I want to be that. This is what I want to be, and I identified with that robot, and so I thought maybe we could do a book that would treat me as the robot, the bot, and so I didn't even need to write software for that, because I think software that is involved in creating literature is viewed by the general reader as a black box. So you do something, you explain that, and then there's magic happening, whatever, and maybe there's some, something going on where you add something, and then something cool comes out. So they never really believe that it was actually some AI or whatever, and so they believe that you're doing dirty tricks because there's a black box. So I thought, well, I don't even need a software. I can do this almost in an analog way. I just have the question. I use whatever I've ever written, diaries, journals, all my novels, whatever, and just do a text search. This is software based, but just do it in Word, and everyone can do it in a way. And this is what we did, and we had a whole book in 3 days, and for some reason, it really became my most personal book, which I didn't anticipate. I was quite surprised that it was so honest and so me, and I really didn't think that. I thought it would be sort of nonsense poetry, like whatever, like so, you know, like the bot wouldn't understand the question and spit out something completely useless or funny, but it was actually a real conversation with me, kind of, and I still haven't recovered from that insight.
That's fascinating. So, Clemens, would you say that that bot is creative?
Well, it seems creative to me. I don't know if it is to its own kind, you know. I don't know if being creative would ever be something interesting to a bot. This is a human category, and of course it's very inventive and surprising, as you know, even very faulty, very bad software chatbots that aren't working, you know, well, that would not pass the Turing test, are very creative, very entertaining, usually. And even if they are very stereotypical in their answer, you know, you get, you know, interesting, you know, sometimes the worse the chatbot is on the internet, the more like a Beckett play it sounds, or like a Harold Pinter play. And so of course the aesthetic pleasure that you can draw from it is endless, if you're in the mood for it. You know, if you're looking at it with Turing test eyes, is this human? Is this intelligent? And of course, this is a kind of a power hierarchy that negates all these pleasurable effects, I think.
Excellent. Perfect. I think what you just said about creativity being a human category and how we define it, we'll talk about that as a group in a moment. We have one more panelist to introduce, and then we'll have an incredible conversation, about 20 minutes, to discuss human and machine creativity. And with that, I'd like to, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, because it just says unmute. Okay, and with that, I'd like to introduce Brian Mccann. He's the co-founder and CTO of Stealth AI startup. Before that, he was a lead research scientist at Salesforce Research in Palo Alto, where he worked on deep learning and its application to natural language processing. But Brian is also a philosopher who's constantly reevaluating the concepts of language, meaning, existence, and aesthetics. Talking to him is immensely rewarding, but we are unfortunately short on time. So I'd like to talk to you, Brian, about a very tangible example of how art and tech can collaborate together to solve a very specific set of problems. Martin and I, we met you through an Open Austria project where we brought renowned author Daniel Kehlmann to the Salesforce research labs in Palo Alto to work with you on the natural language processing algorithm control. And so you worked on a fascinating premise about human and artificial creativity, which was, can an AI write literature, or at least be a true asset in the creative writing process? So I would love for you to introduce us to the project and what you thought were the tangible outcomes.
Yeah, great. Maybe I can start by just showing a little bit of a demo of what that process looks like with this particular kind of language machine. And I'll kind of do a talk over as I go so that I can explain what's going on here. So with these particular kind of language machines that in AI we call language models, which it's kind of a generic term. And we've obviously had different kinds of language machines for a long time. With these, it's almost like in the simplest form, you can treat it as a very interesting form of autocomplete. So here I've just saved some typing time and copied in some text. But then I can hit tab in this interface and kind of get suggestions. It's like a very powerful autocomplete. It's a little bit random, so I don't really know what's going to come up every time. And you can kind of interact with it and say, with this particular language model, we have a sense of something, and you can just keep asking for suggestions. Now, the way that this is working is we're training some relatively large AI compared to the past to take in examples of sequences of text where you have maybe 500 to 1,000 tokens, and then it always tries to predict the next one. And what it's doing here is not doing like a search. It's not doing a lookup over different parts of the internet or something. I'm just auto-completing these randomly myself at this point. But in some sense, we are just asking it to look at all the text on the internet and then tell us what the next word is. And if we just iterate that process, we get sentences and paragraphs and all sorts of things. So what does that look like as we keep doing it? Well, I have some other examples here from control. These are the ones that I generated from the previous model yesterday, and you can see how I typed in the same kind of starting prompt there, but I actually got quite different text, and sections that are highlighted are what are created by the model. With control, we took a little bit of another step and started associating special tokens, control codes, with chunks of text from around the internet. And that way we could prompt the model with these control codes later. And in kind of one of the most interesting cases, we had books. So we were able to kind of get it to mimic the structure of different texts from Project Gutenberg. And this is where we started looking to working with Daniel, which was a blast, because then we started associating these control codes like books or Wikipedia or reviews. We thought maybe we can give Daniel his own. And we can give the codes for early Daniel and German Daniel and English Daniel because he writes in multiple languages. And what we found is when Daniel came on Valentine's Day early this year, before so many things have happened, we sat down together with the AI, and for the whole day, we kind of had this process of him typing things in, trying to get auto-completed suggestions, playing with the AI. And the most fun part for me was seeing him laugh or be surprised or be inspired and sit back and go, huh, I wouldn't have done that, but that's actually a really good idea. And that process was something that I'd seen happen before as well. As we were working on the algorithm, my collaborator, Nitish Keskar, wonderful, wonderful person to work with, at some point we started generating poems, and he read one of them and just sat back and said, I find that actually quite moving. And he was never really interested in poems before, for whatever reasons. But over the next couple months, we started getting into poetry. I started giving him different authors and assessing his different tastes. So it's very interesting as a tool for inspiration. And we were exploring different ways of having humans interact with it and what level it was at. So with Daniel, we could never quite get a full short novel because the models, the way they were at the time, had such a limited window that they could look into. They had kind of a limited time range. But I can share some more examples very quickly of some from even more powerful models that have come out just in the last couple of months. So here's some from an algorithm called GPT-3. This is a list of different poets and different prompts. This is from Guerin.net if you want to go check those out. These are all public. And you can kind of look up some of your favorite poets and see how well the algorithm can try to mimic their style. There's also different ways to, so we can look at all these different ones and check it out. There's also a lot of examples online as you, if you look around Twitter and search for things like GPT-3, you'll see examples of people typing in descriptions and then having it plug into design tools or math equations and derive all sorts of interesting results. At Salesforce, before I left, we were applying it to the language of proteins. So it's really expanding our sense of what language is and all these different patterns and what language models can work with. So there's all sorts of interesting questions about what meaning is and different layers of meaning that come up. And some people kind of interact with it and get different kinds of feelings. But they're all very interesting as we're seeing these things become more powerful.
Thank you. It's fascinating. I mean, especially now with the latest research, we're really across the new barrier here. It's fascinating that you should mention that we're in need of a new terminology, that how we define language might not suffice, and we kind of need to redefine it, or those algorithms actually help us understand language as we use it much better than we did before. So it's not just this one-way street, it's actually a constant, a give and take, so to speak. And with that, if it's okay with you, I would really love to broaden this conversation with our five panelists and talk about meaning, talk about language, and be as philosophical as we can get, because all of you are not only working in technology, but truly analyzing what it means to be human in this day and age. So, Vanessa?
Thank you, Clara. Yeah, I think there's something really lovely about finishing on that image of completing sentences, because I think this question about what the future of literature is as we integrate these kinds of tools is really central to me, right? Like how will language change what it means? How does how do code and coded language inform literary language? So I'd like to invite a broader conversation about your thoughts. How do you envision the future of AI-driven creativity and literary writing? And how do you think that these kinds of algorithmic tools reshape language? Do they change it in ways that make them less human, more human, something else?
Can I start, maybe?
Sure.
I don't know. Do we do it with hand signals? What's...
First come, first serve.
Okay, so let's start. What I notice with myself is that whenever I encounter anything that's been written by a machine, or that has been suggested to a human who uses it, I still have, and I suspect this will change very soon, but it's very ingrained in me, and I can't lose it right now, but I will eventually. I still see it as something that's defective. I still see it as not quite there, as not having achieved the height of sophistication or whatever, as a poorer creature than me in a way. So this is, of course, through the looking that, or what's the word, through the perspective of the eternal Turing test, sort of, are you human or are you something else? And even when I heard about Daniel Kehlmann being moved, I remembered immediately something that happened to me. I read a German poem by a Twitter bot, which is quite famous now in the among poetry in German, and I was very moved by the line, and then I asked myself, am I moved because I see it as something that wants to sound human, that wants to be me, and I have compassion for that, sort of virtual compassion, or is it really moving? And I couldn't not quite answer that yet, but I suspect with AI becoming more sophisticated, more complex, and leading our lives in a more, in a way that I wouldn't question, I would probably lose that. I will probably view it as equal, above me, larger than me, godlike, whatever, and this perspective will be a very distant memory soon.
My sense, definitely working with Daniel and working with others, and even looking at some of the more the examples that seem a little bit better at imitating authors now with GPT-3. My sense is very much that, for whatever reason, like we're still the ones making the meaning. Like it feels like part of us, that even though these algorithms are doing the recombination part, which some people have postulated are a huge part of what it is to make meaning, just kind of moving the symbols around and understanding the statistical patterns that will trigger a sense or a feeling of what meaning is. But the feeling is still in us. And I think that goes back to what people have said before about we are the ones with the lived experiences. We are the ones that make that order of symbols, which aren't really that special in the world compared to other orders of symbols. But until we come and we look at them and we project onto them. But the interesting part about it is that they're at least doing something that is inspiring us in different ways, and they continue to do that as the decades and the centuries go by. These machines are kind of interacting with us and are part of the conversation in some way. So I don't know. It depends on what kind of layer of meaning I guess we're looking at and what we want. But it is exciting to see our own notions of that challenge sometimes.
I mean, we've been doing this for a very, very long time, right? So
yeah.
If you throw a bunch of tablets on a floor and make found poetry out of it, how is that different from a machine offering you a bunch of choices, right? And selfishly, in my daily life as a writer, I want two things, or maybe many things. But first, when I work in Granthika now writing my own fiction, I want to be relieved at least a little bit of the burden of keeping track of a timeline on my own, right? So that's like conventional logic. But what Andrew and I were talking about, we've been talking about over weeks, is that if I'm trying to write a simile or a metaphor, I want the machine to suggest some completely insane stuff to me, right? So again, I'm liberated from the familiar patterns that I'm trapped in, and I can use 5 of them, right? Choose between the 5 that seem most palatable to me, right? And I mean, I don't want to sound like woo-woo about all of this. This will obviously, and is now being used for evil as well, right? So there's the familiar metaphor that you put a human being and a machine together and you make a unicorn, right? A human being apparently now cannot defeat a computer in chess, right? But no computer can beat a machine and a human being playing together as a team, right? But the thing to remember is a 13-year-old boy armed with an AK-47 is also a unicorn, right? And so it's very two-edged, as every tool that we've ever invented has worked like this, right? And seeing this being born, my children will know much better what new stuff to make out of it, right? I'm still trapped in the patterns that I'm used to, right? It took a while for people making early cinema to realize that you could actually make a cut, right? To understand what the grammar of filmmaking was, how you can go from a long shot to a close-up and make an emotional difference in what people were reacting, how they were reacting.
Yeah, I think just to add a quick 2 cents is, I think the Turing test has done a lot to obscure other ways of thinking about these tools. We're constantly caught in this idea of simulation or these quasi-human-like, rather than in a domain of inspiration. What can we do with them? And as Vikram said, we do have to give a lot of thought and be very, very careful about both the positive and the negative. Automatic writing can be used for scaling things that we want to see less of. And on the other hand, it can also be ways of inspiring us to be unpredictable and noisier as a society. So it is hard to figure out how we balance those 2 things. But for me, always the most important thing is to get past our anxieties of simulation and replacement to ones of inspiration and creativity.
I usually think about it like a tortilla machine. Like you grind maize into masa, and then you can or not, you can choose to put that ground into a tortilla maker that is a machine that makes identical tortillas, or you can choose to take it somewhere else and make the tortillas by hand. And you can then choose like what stage in all of these processes you would like to opt out of this machine or that machine. Like you're saying, we have a long history of choosing when to apply a machine is part of the creative action. Is the thing itself creative? Like I don't know. I don't find them very creative. I think they're fairly predictable, and that's like why they're useful. And I also think the other thing, important thing to remember about when we use the term AI is that these are not, even if you just think about like the math, they're worse at doing their job than previous versions of like similar search algorithms. It's just that they're faster. So this is not like a new shiny thing. We're like, we've never done this before. They're faster, and they can be combined in interesting ways. But it's very similar to a tortilla machine. Like, do you choose to use this machine? Do you choose to use this machine? What is the outcome? What is the cultural context of that outcome? Does your restaurant pride itself on that you can produce 10,000 tacos a day? Or does your restaurant pride itself on the fact that every tortilla is made by hand and you only make a different number of tacos a day? Like, it's our choices make meaning from machines, because meaning doesn't matter to them. Meaning only matters to us. So we're the only ones who are ever going to make it.
Maybe I'll jump in too, because there was a couple points there that were really relevant, and I want to echo some of the research we found. One was M's point on these machines are predictable. Sometimes when we read the text, it seems kind of noisy, or it seems like it's different from us. But actually, if you train a separate system to try to detect whether this is human or AI generated, the patterns are quite different. And the language models, in this case, like the ones that I showed, even though they look somewhat fluent, they are very predictable. Whereas humans are very good at choosing unpredictable words for exactly the right context. So there's still a huge gap in the way that we're doing this. These things are it's just the trend that we're seeing is that as the language models get better, you need better algorithms to detect the differences, right? So they're kind of getting better at this slowly, and very expensively. But the other point that Vikram and Andrew both brought up as well is these things are trained now on pretty much all of the public internet you can get your hands on. If you've heard of Common Crawl or things like that, the most recent one I just showed of GPT-3 is trained on pretty much all of it. And that means a lot about the kinds of biases it might encode, the kinds of prejudices, and those are things that we don't have a really good understanding of how to control. And that's why some of this conversation really, and a lot of the research community around these things really has to dig into figuring out what's going on. It's another way of kind of measuring the field of language that we can't see, but we all know is there, and like the needle is moving, right? And we're watching it, like it's some electromagnetic field or something like that. But actually learning how to control it and manipulate it and use it responsibly is going to be a big challenge in the near future.
Great, thank you, Brian. I think that's a really good note to close the panel on, and thinking about what you're saying about how it's important for us to, as a research community, address these questions. And as Em was highlighting, right, artists highlight how we make those choices, and when what we do with the technologies are also kind of artistic choices as much as technological ones. And so that's something that we need to include everyone in that research community as we make these questions. So thank you.
Very much in the spirit of the grid, right? Bringing all those silos together. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming here today. And I'm very sorry because I feel like this discussion was simultaneously very profound and very intense, but also we just started scratching the surface, and this could go on for hours. I love this team. That's a dream team. Let's do it again. And we have one more special guest here.
Yes, everyone, I'm really pleased to close out our panel with a little short talk by Kat Mostatea, who is a playwright and technologist. Her tech-native storytelling stretches theater into the digital age, and she's here to talk briefly about her work with synthetic language and AI, and her Instagram-based performance Voidopolis, which is showing throughout the festival. Take it away, Kat.
Yeah, so I've been doing a project called Voidopolis on my Instagram. It's an episodic series of posts. I'm about 20 posts in, and it'll be about 40 posts total. It's called Voidopolis, and it's a retelling of Dante's Inferno. And I took that as a departure to talk about the experience of living in New York City during the pandemic. Instead of Virgil, my guide through this infernal place is a hobo named Nikita, who's actually not very nice to me. And the entire text is composed using what I call synthetic language. It's part of a series of explorations in which I'm using a modified text generator, similar to what Brian mentioned earlier. And I'm generating text with specific kinds of constraints. In this case, I'm just removing any word that doesn't have the letter E. So the entire text makes sense grammatically and is meaningful, but it only uses words that don't contain the letter E. If you know of the literary movement from the 1960s, OuLiPo, I would call this project OuLiPo adjacent. And to my great delight, Vanessa and Clara and the folks at Codeme have allowed me to cross-post for the entire week on the Codeme Instagram as well. And so you can read the entire project on my Instagram, but this week you can also read posts that are on the Codeme Instagram as well. And to take advantage of the rather delightful opportunity to do this project in 2 different places, today's episode is actually different across the 2 Instagram accounts, and tomorrow's post will be unique only to Codeme, but will not ever live on the on my Instagram account. And I should also say, very importantly, relating to memory, that that this project will be wiped away once I'm done. And so my whole thing in doing this project was that perhaps we will all want to forget one day that we lived through such a cataclysm, and I might not want this to ever be visible again. And so after the 40 posts are done, it will be removed and it will no longer exist.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your work, Kat. You can go to Codeme's Instagram as well as Kat's Instagram to see and experience Voidopolis. With that, we will bring this panel to a close. As Clara said, we've really only scratched the surface, and there's clearly so much more to think about and explore when we think about the intersection of literature and AI. So look for the communities that are coming out of this intersection, look for the work that's coming out of the grid, and keep an eye on projects moving ahead. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.